It looks like it's the end of the road for General Motors' Oshawa plant. The company announced today it plans to stop sending product to the plant and effectively close the facility in 2019. 2,500 workers are in shock. But was some of the writing on the wall? In 2009, in the depths of the recession, automakers needed rescuing. That included General Motors. Ottawa and Ontario bailed it out of bankruptcy with $10.8 billion. In return, GM agreed to keep 16% of its North American manufacturing in Canada until 2016. Early in 2016, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met with GM President Mary Barra to make Canada's case. But about a year after that, GM reported a drop in Canadian car sales, so it scaled back car production. According to Scotiabank, between September of 2017 and September of 2018, the Oshawa plant assembled 110,000 cars, which were either a Chevrolet Impala, a Cadillac XTS, the Chevrolet Silverado, or the GMC Sierra. That's 50,000 less cars than what it produced the year before and represents only about 5% of total auto production in Canada. Then there was GM's red flag back in June. It said proposed U.S. auto tariffs would lead to a smaller GM, a reduced presence at home and abroad. Which brings us to today. GM is closing 5 North American plants, including Oshawa's plant. That totals almost 15,000 jobs, 2,500 of those in Oshawa alone. There is anger and uncertainty in Oshawa today because of that decision. GM says the planned facility closure is part of a global restructuring plan that will see it shift focus to hybrid and electric cars, which the company says can't be manufactured or not manufactured at the Oshawa plant. The company also says the restructuring will save an estimated $6 billion by the end of 2020. Should Canada have seen this coming? Brett House is the Deputy Chief Economist for Scotiabank Economics. Hi, Mr. House. Great to see you again.
Good to see you.
So GM says that this plant had been operating well below full capacity for several years. Was the writing on the wall?
Well, I don't think there's anything inevitable about a plant closure. It is the case, though, that GM has been reducing its production in Canada over the last decade and a half or so. If you go back to 2003, GM was producing almost 1 million cars in Canada, and it now produces only about 330 cars between its various plants in the country. So production by GM has been going down, and I don't think that's necessarily a reflection on Canadian workers or Canadian competitiveness so much as changes in the industry and the health of the company itself.
What can you go into a little bit more on that? What exactly, because there are people saying, oh, it's because the cars were just too expensive to make here in Canada. What is really behind the decrease, of those production levels?
Well, when you look at costs in Ontario versus the United States, the gap between them isn't very large at all. And in fact, if you take in an all-in approach where you're looking at the benefits companies receive from the public health care system here, the education system, a stable social safety net, and safe communities, I think the costs more or less look pretty equal between the two places. What has happened, though, for GM is that, and for all car companies, is that the industry is changing with the arrival of electric vehicles, the possible arrival of autonomous vehicles, and increasing competition from other countries in the world. So when you look at the GM announcement today, I think it's important to focus on the fact, too, that it's not just the Oshawa plant that is potentially being closed, but 6 other factories, 4 of which are in the United States and 2 of which are elsewhere.
I'm glad you just said that, potentially being closed, because I wanted to ask you for clarification. The wording that they use is that product won't be allocated there past a certain date. Does that mean that the plant will close for sure?
I don't think it does on past experience, because we've seen announcements like this previously with respect to the Centre East plant in Quebec that is now closed, and with respect to the Ontario plants. And I think that's as much a statement that the plant may close as it is an invitation for local, provincial, and federal government to engage in a conversation with the company on what might keep production going there with the allocation of a new model. It is interesting wording, and I think it is certainly wording that leaves at least a glimmer of hope.
So break that down for us. Do you mean that there is the potential, for example, for the government to strike a deal to move a different kind of product to be made at this plant?
Well, it could be, because when you look at production and the rules that have been created under the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement on trade, there is a really high priority on ensuring that an increasing share of production is reflected by research and development and high tech. and also is done in relatively high-wage factories in North America. All of those things bode well for Canadian production. So if GM wants to ensure that its production remains consistent with the new rules that are being struck for North American free trade, there are some real arguments for keeping production inside Ontario.
President Trump earlier today said that the company should save the plants slated to close by, quote, putting something else in it. It looks like he's going to be making that kind of effort, or at least he's, rhetorically applying that kind of pressure today. Could that help or hinder Canada's chance to do the same?
It's hard to say in some ways because, he's talked about the fact that the Cruise, which is one of the small cars produced by General Motors, is not selling well, and that's one of the cars that's produced in the Ohio plant. One of the things about the new rules under USMCA is that it does overall increase the costs of production in North America, and if you add in the tariffs on steel and aluminum, which GM itself has said cost $1 billion to its bottom line this year, the Trump approach to trade is not making North American auto production more competitive. And so if it's a question of replacing one small car with another, I think that's pretty unlikely. Small car production is getting more and more difficult under Trump trade policy in North America. If it's a question, though, instead of locating, electric vehicle production or SUV or CUV production where consumer tastes have drifted to, that might be a more productive avenue to go down.
Does it strike you as odd at all that those conversations, or at least that politicians have not alluded to those conversations taking place before? Because we knew that the strings attached to the bailout was just that a certain amount of manufacturing would take place in Canada until 2016. There's a 2-year gap there where, I wonder what kind of conversations took place. I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, I can't say that I've been privy to those conversations, but what I think it is fair to say is that the Canadian government and the Ontario governments have both taken steps to continually ensure that manufacturing remains competitive in Canada. If you look at the fall economic statement that just came out, the accelerated depreciation measures would be exactly the sort of thing that you would expect would help incentivize investment in retooling the Oshawa plant to put in a new model. When you look at the trade diversification strategy, the transportation corridors that are also provided for in the fall economic statement, those are things that ought to be net pretty positive for manufacturing here. Add to that the fact that Canada is the only G7 country with trade agreements with all 6 other G7 countries. The incentive to locate here rather than elsewhere has gotten stronger rather than less so.
Are you surprised, though, that I guess that message, at least with on the face of it, today's announcement doesn't seem to have been absorbed?
Well, one of the things to take note, though, is the particular situation for GM. It was 40% of automobile manufacturing in Canada as recently as 2007. It's now, in the mid-teens. It's smaller in Canadian manufacturing than Toyota, Chrysler, and Ford. So I don't think the fortunes of one company are necessarily indicative of the health of manufacturing in Ontario as a whole. And even if Oshawa is closed and the impact on the local community is massive, I grew up just west of St. Catharines, and when the plants closed there, it had a devastating impact on the community. There is still the possibility that parts production can continue in a substantial way, even if we lose, that portion of assembly. But I think it's important to underscore that, the workers in Ontario are amongst the most efficient and effective in the world. We've got some of the highest technology manufacturing in the world. The case for continuing to produce here is strong.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. House. Appreciate your insight.
Thank you.